Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of, like, precision. It feels like engineering.
Right, very mechanical.
Yeah, exactly. Like you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line across the radius bone, and the doctor just points and says, "Whoa, there it is."
And that provides a profound sense of comfort.
Mm.
And we are visually dominant creatures.
We really are.
So we like things to be visible, categorized, binary. It's broken or not broken, sick or healthy.
But then you step into the world of human consciousness. You start looking at neurodevelopment or behavioral interventions, altered states, and suddenly that x-ray machine is just utterly useless.
Completely useless.
Right. We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely invisible to the naked eye. So today, for this deep dive, we are looking at some of the most cutting-edge cognitive neuroscience alongside, well, centuries-old psychological practices.
To map exactly what happens to human consciousness when it shifts gears.
Exactly. If you've ever wondered what is physically happening inside the brain when someone enters a hypnotic trance, or when they meditate so deeply that their sense of self just vanishes, you are in the right place.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters, but, that is the core tension we're exploring today.
Yeah, because for centuries, these practices like clinical hypnosis and deep mindfulness meditation, they were relegated almost entirely to the realms of mysticism.
Right, they were the domain of ancient sleep temples or esoteric spiritual traditions or, eventually just cheap stage entertainment.
But the paradigm has completely flipped. Today, these exact same practices are sitting squarely at the center of high-resolution neuroimaging studies.
They really are. We aren't looking at abstract philosophy today. We're breaking down the specific mechanics.
The exact syntactic structures of words, right?
Yes, the words, the localized brain networks, and the precise neurochemical cascades that allow humans to bypass their own critical faculties.
Which is wild. To feel complex trauma and literally reshape the physical hardware of their brains.
It is incredible. But to understand how we map the brain with such precision today, we actually have to start by looking at how spectacularly we misunderstood it in the past.
Oh, absolutely, because humanity has possessed this tool, this ability to radically alter consciousness and induce healing for about 4,000 years.
We just had absolutely no idea how it worked.
Not a clue.
The historical evolution of altered states perfectly illustrates human psychology. I mean, we have always been brilliant at recognizing a powerful phenomenon when we see it.
But we are consistently terrible at attributing its source.
Exactly. We can trace these practices all the way back to ancient Egypt, Greece, and India. Let's look at the ancient Greeks as a prime example.
Okay, yeah.
They utilized these massive complexes called sleep temples. They were dedicated to Asclepius, the god of medicine.
Right. So just picture this for a second. You are a citizen of ancient Greece, you're suffering from a chronic illness, and you travel for days to reach one of these temples.
A pilgrimage, basically.
Yeah, and the priests take you into a dark, subterranean chamber filled with incense and chanting.
Right, and that environment is highly intentional. Patients engaged in what were called incubation rituals.
Incubation rituals? That sounds intense.
It was. They would be guided into profound, trance-like states in these sensory-controlled chambers, essentially waiting for healing instructions.
Or a direct physical cure, right, delivered by the gods in a dream.
Exactly. And the fascinating thing is, it often worked.
Wait, really? It worked?
Oh, yeah. People experienced spontaneous remission of psychosomatic illnesses. They experienced profound pain relief.
Wow. But the mechanism was framed entirely as divine intervention.
Right. They believed the gods were literally reaching down and fixing the body.
So they had the right result, but just the entirely wrong equation.
Perfectly said.
And this misattribution just keeps mutating over the centuries. Fast forward to the 16th century, and you have the Swiss physician Paracelsus.
Yes, Paracelsus. He takes a crucial step away from the gods, but he replaces theology with astrology.
Right. He theorizes that heavenly bodies, like stars and planets, exert an influence on human disease through a universal magnetic fluid.
A fluid that permeates the entire universe, which sounds completely wild to a modern ear.
It sounds like magic.
It does, but scientifically, he was trying to build a rational model based on the invisible forces he observed, like gravity and lodestones.
So he was at least trying to be scientific.
Exactly. And Paracelsus laid the conceptual groundwork for one of the most infamous and polarizing figures in the history of medicine.
Franz Mesmer.
In the late 18th century, yes. Mesmer took Paracelsus's astrological fluid and brought it down to earth.
He introduces the concept of animal magnetism, and Mesmer is just such a wild character.
Oh, he really was.
He believed this invisible, natural energy force flowed through all living beings, and his theory of pathology was simple.
If you were physically or mentally ill, it was simply because there was a blockage in your magnetic fluid.
Right. And his clinics in Paris were just pure theatrical spectacle.
Unbelievable spectacle. Mesmer would construct these large oak tubs called baquets.
Like big wooden barrels.
Basically, yeah. They were filled with magnetized water and had iron rods protruding from the sides.
That is bizarre.
Patients would sit in a circle, holding the rods and connecting to each other with ropes to pass the magnetic fluid around.
It sounds like a seance.
It looked like one.
Huh.
Mesmer would then enter the room wearing vibrant purple silk robes.
Of course he did.
Right. And he'd be playing a glass harmonica to create this eerie, ethereal atmosphere. He would make dramatic passes over the patients with his hands or an iron wand.
And the patients would just lose their minds. They would enter what he called crises.
Yes, crises.
Which were essentially violent, hysterical convulsions. People would scream, laugh uncontrollably, or faint.
And after the crisis passed, many claimed they were completely cured of their ailments.
Because they genuinely believed Mesmer was manipulating their magnetic fields with his wand.
They absolutely did. But the scientific establishment of Paris was naturally highly suspicious.
I would hope so.
So in 1784, King Louis XVI commissioned an investigation to figure out if this magnetic fluid actually existed.
And this royal commission was a powerhouse of Enlightenment science, right?
It really was. It included Benjamin Franklin, who was the American ambassador at the time.
Right.
Antoine Lavoisier, the father of modern chemistry, and Joseph Ignace Guillotin.
They basically invented the double-blind study just to debunk this guy.
They did. They realized they needed to isolate the variables, so they brought in some of Mesmer's most reactive patients and blindfolded them.
Okay, so they can't see what's happening.
Right. First, they would tell the patient they were being magnetized by Mesmer's top disciple behind a curtain.
When in reality,
no one was doing anything. But the patients went into violent convulsions anyway.
Oh, wow.
Then, they would secretly magnetize the patients without telling them.
Let me guess. Nothing happened.
Nothing happened. The patients remained completely calm.
So they completely destroyed his theory.
Completely. The commission concluded that the magnetic fluid was entirely fictitious.
And they attributed all of his miraculous cures to imagination, imitation, and what we would now call the placebo effect.
Yes. But the tragedy of that commission is that while they brilliantly discredited the magnetic fluid, they threw the baby out with the bathwater.
How so?
Well, they didn't deny the profound healing was occurring, but because the mechanism was just imagination, they dismissed it as medically useless.
Oh, I see.
They failed to realize that the imagination itself is a biological mechanism capable of altering physiology.
But someone did realize it eventually.
Yes, one of Mesmer's former disciples, the Marquis de Puysegur, pivots the entire field.
He takes a completely different approach. Instead of inducing violent screaming convulsions, he discovers something he calls artificial somnambulism.
Puysegur was working with a local peasant on his estate named Victor.
And instead of the typical mesmeric crisis, Victor fell into a profound, peaceful, sleep-like trance.
Exactly. While in this state, Victor was incredibly lucid, highly responsive to Puysegur's commands, and showed no memory of the event upon waking.
And Puysegur famously magnetized a large elm tree on his estate, right?
He did. And patients would come sit against it, entering these peaceful trances and experiencing pain relief.
Which brings in Abbé Faria a few decades later. Faria looks at Puysegur's sleepwalkers and realizes something incredibly profound.
He completely discards the magnetic theory altogether.
He realizes the tree doesn't matter, the iron rods don't matter, the purple robes definitely don't matter.
Right. Faria argues that the trance state is generated entirely from within the mind of the patient,
driven solely by their own expectancy and their own cognitive cooperation.
And that is the pivotal moment. It marks the shift from an operator-centered dogma.
Meaning the belief that the hypnotist possesses some mystical power that they force onto a passive subject.
Exactly. It shifts from that to a subject-centered science. It recognizes that the power to alter consciousness resides entirely within the patient's own neurological architecture.
So the clinician is merely a guide.
Yes, providing a specific set of instructions to unlock what is already there.
I look at this history and I think, was this essentially a 200-year branding problem?
It kind of was, yeah.
We had the cure, the mechanism was sitting right there, but we kept wrapping it in the wrong packaging.
That's a great way to put it.
It feels like discovering a massive software update for your computer that fixes all your bugs. But for 2 centuries, humanity thinks the update only installs because you are casting magic spells at the monitor.
The software analogy is perfect because it highlights the necessity of the correct interface. We didn't understand the interface until a Scottish surgeon named James Braid came along in the 1840s.
He is widely considered the father of modern clinical hypnotism.
Yes. Braid observed a mesmerist performing on stage and was initially highly skeptical.
But as a medical man, he noticed something peculiar about the subject's eyes.
He hypothesized that the trance wasn't magnetism, and it wasn't just imagination. He realized it was a physiological fatigue of the nervous system.
Caused by protracted ocular fixation, like staring really hard at something?
Exactly. He would hold his shiny silver pocket watch slightly above the patient's eye line, forcing them to strain their optical nerves upward.
And by forcing the eyes into an unnatural upward converging position, the optic nerve fatigues rapidly.
Precisely. The brain, seeking relief from this sensory strain, forces the eyelids to close and triggers a localized relaxation response.
Which cascades into a wider central nervous system depression.
Right. Braid coined the term neurohypnotism, literally nervous sleep.
Derived from hypnos, the Greek god of sleep. But he instantly regretted naming it that, right?
He did, because he quickly discovered, through further experiments, that hypnosis is physiologically completely distinct from natural sleep.
A hypnotized person is hyper-focused, not unconscious.
Exactly. He tried to change the name to monoideism.
Which means the concentration of the mind upon a single idea.
Yes. It is a wildly more accurate description of the state. But by then, the term hypnosis had saturated the medical literature. It was too late to rebrand it.
So Braid grounds it in biology. You'd think the medical community would unite behind this, but instead it sparks a massive, bitter rivalry in the late 19th century.
Oh, a huge rivalry between 2 prominent French schools of neurology.
On one side, you have the Salpêtrière School in Paris, led by Jean-Martin Charcot.
Charcot was a rock star of neurology at the time. But he fundamentally misunderstood trance.
He firmly believed that hypnosis was a somatic abnormality, right?
Yes, he thought it was a pathology inextricably linked to clinical hysteria. In his view, a healthy brain could not be hypnotized.
Only a sick, neurologically compromised brain could enter trance.
Charcot's prestige gave his erroneous theory a lot of weight, but he was challenged by the Nancy School, led by Hippolyte Bernheim and Ambroise Auguste Liabeau.
And they observed thousands of healthy, normal, everyday people entering profound trance states.
Right. They correctly argued that hypnosis was a perfectly normal psychological phenomenon driven entirely by suggestibility.
It wasn't a symptom of a diseased brain. It was a feature of a healthy, functioning mind capable of deep concentration.
Exactly. And the Nancy School eventually wins that debate. Their suggestion-based model prevails and basically sets the stage for the entire 20th century.
Influencing figures like Sigmund Freud, who used it early in his career to uncover repressed memories.
Yes, and later, master clinicians like Milton Erickson and Dave Ellman, who we are going to break down in detail later.
And it's important to recognize that while the West was fighting its battles over hypnosis and suggestion, a parallel secularization was happening with Eastern meditative practices.
Right. Contemplative traditions like Vipassana and Zen Buddhism had utilized hyper-focused attention for millennia.
But they were deeply intertwined with religious and esoteric frameworks.
You actually see this secular shift happen perfectly in 1979 with a molecular biologist named John Kabat-Zinn.
He founded the Stress Reduction Clinic at the University of Massachusetts Medical School.
Kabat-Zinn essentially looked at these ancient Buddhist practices, looked at Hatha Yoga, and systematically stripped away all the religious dogma.
He took the functional mechanics of meditation and repackaged them into mindfulness-based stress reduction, or MBSR.
Kabat-Zinn fundamentally changed the landscape by defining mindfulness operationally.
He defined it as awareness that arises through paying attention, on purpose, in the present moment, non-judgmentally.
By operationalizing it, giving it a secular, testable definition, he allowed contemplative practices to be subjected to rigorous, randomized controlled trials.
He proved that you didn't need to adopt a spiritual belief system to experience the profound physiological benefits of deep meditation.
Exactly.
Okay, so the historical dust settles. We got rid of the purple robes, the magnets, and the magic.
The medical community accepts that these states exist and that they're driven by internal psychology and focus.
But even in the late 20th century, neuroscientists still couldn't agree on what was actually happening in the brain.
Right. How is it possible that a century after James Braid, we still didn't have a unified model?
Which brings us to the most brutal theoretical divide in the field's history, the state versus non-state debate.
This debate completely fractured the psychological community because it asked a fundamental question about the nature of human consciousness.
On one side, you have the state theories. This was championed heavily in the 1970s by Ernest Hilgard with his neo-dissociation model.
Hilgard proposed that hypnosis induces a genuine, distinct, biologically altered state of consciousness.
He argued that trance creates a literal division or dissociation within the brain's executive control systems.
He theorized an amnesic barrier, a literal cognitive wall that drops down, separating the conscious awareness of the subject from the subconscious processes that are carrying out the hypnotist's commands.
Yes, and to prove this amnesic barrier existed, Hilgard developed the concept of the hidden observer.
He ran a series of famous experiments involving the cold Tresor test.
Which sounds awful.
It is. He would take a highly hypnotizable subject, put them into a deep trance, and give them a suggestion of complete analgesia, absolute pain relief.
Okay.
Then he would have them submerge their hand into a tank of violently circulating freezing ice water.
Anyone who has done an ice bath knows that pain becomes unbearable in about 30 seconds. It feels like your bones are being crushed.
But the hypnotized subjects would sit there for minutes, smiling, completely relaxed.
Wow.
When Hilgard asked the conscious subject to rate their pain on a scale of 0 to 10, they would consistently report 0. No pain at all.
But Hilgard hypothesized that the pain signals were still reaching the brain. They were just sequestered behind that amnesic barrier.
Right. There was a dissociated part of the mind, the hidden observer, that was still registering objective reality.
So how do you talk to an observer that is hidden behind a wall?
Hilgard would give a secondary suggestion. He would tell the subject, when I place my hand on your shoulder, I will be able to speak directly to the hidden part of you that knows what is really happening. Your conscious self will not hear this.
That's just wild.
He would touch the shoulder and ask the hidden observer to report the pain level via automatic writing.
Having the subject's free hand write on a notepad without the subject consciously looking at it?
Yes. The conscious face remained smiling, reporting 0 pain. But the handwriting on the notepad would frantically scribble that the water was agonizingly cold, rating it a 9 or a 10.
For Hilgard, this proved that the brain was structurally divided. It proved a unique, altered state of consciousness was occurring.
Exactly.
I hear that, and it sounds like bulletproof evidence, but then you have the non-state theories aggressively pushing back.
Right. You have researchers like Theodore Sarbin, Nicholas Spanos, and Irving Kirsch.
They look at Hilgard's hidden observer and say, no, there is no magical altered state. There is no amnesic barrier.
They call their framework the sociocognitive model.
The sociocognitive camp argues that hypnosis is nothing more than complex role enactment, social compliance, and response expectancy.
They argue that the subject is essentially just acting out how they believe a hypnotized person is supposed to act, based on cultural scripts and the social pressure of the clinical environment.
I really struggle with the non-state theory. When I hear role enactment, it sounds like the placebo effect on absolute steroids.
It does sound like that.
It's like saying you are pretending to be asleep so incredibly well that you actually trick your own body into snoring.
Right. Kirsch's response expectancy theory basically says that if you strongly believe a suggestion will work, like, my arm is too heavy to lift, that belief directly causes the involuntary response.
You just expect it, so it happens. No special trance required.
Spanos ran experiments to counter Hilgard. He argued that the hidden observer only appeared because Hilgard's instructions implicitly told the subject that a hidden observer should exist.
Oh, that makes sense.
Spanos proved that if you change the instructions to suggest that the hidden observer is actually highly resilient and feels less pain, the automatic writing suddenly reports lower pain scores.
Spanos argued the subjects were just highly compliant people eager to please the researcher.
Exactly.
Okay, if it's just compliance, here's my pushback. How can mere social compliance or role-playing explain a patient undergoing major surgery without chemical anesthesia?
That's the big question.
Because James Esdale, a Scottish surgeon, was doing hundreds of major amputations in India in the 1840s using nothing but hypnotic trance.
Yes, and it is still done today in hospitals in Belgium and France for patients who are allergic to chemical anesthesia.
You cannot just role-play your way through a scalpel cutting into your abdomen. Your heart rate would spike, you would go into shock.
That is the exact breaking point of the sociocognitive model. When you look at extreme physiological modulation, like stopping bleeding, suppressing blister formation from a burn, or surgical analgesia, the role-playing theory entirely collapses.
You cannot consciously role-play a reduction in histamine release.
You really can't. Modern theorists have attempted to bridge this divide with something called cold control theory.
How does that work?
Cold control theory suggests that hypnosis involves forming a conscious intention to act while simultaneously suppressing the higher-order thoughts of reflective awareness.
Basically, you decide to lift your arm, but you intentionally forget that you made the decision, making the movement feel entirely involuntary.
Right. But even this is a psychological description, not a biological mechanism.
Right, it's just moving the mystery around. So how do we finally end a 100-year debate?
We need biometric proof that a hypnotized brain operates on a fundamentally different electrical wavelength than a highly compliant brain that is simply pretending.
To definitively prove the state theory, neuroscientists are utilizing 256-channel high-density EEG caps.
Yes. A standard EEG might have 20 sensors. 256 sensors provide a massive, real-time topographical map of the brain's electrical activity.
And what are they looking for with all those sensors?
They're looking for a distinct biomarker specifically, the involuntary phase locking of theta and alpha brain waves in the frontal and parietal regions.
Theta waves are associated with deep relaxation and access to unconscious material, right?
Oh, yes, and alpha waves are associated with relaxed internal focus. When a subject enters deep trance, these waves phase lock. Their peaks and troughs synchronize across different regions of the brain.
And you cannot consciously fake phase locking.
Impossible. If researchers consistently capture this neuroelectrical signature in hypnotized subjects and prove it doesn't exist in subjects who are just role-playing, it conclusively ends the debate.
Hypnosis is a distinct, measurable biological state.
Exactly.
So if we want to know what the state really is, we have to look under the hood at the neuroimaging. We need to leave the behavioral observation behind and look at the actual blood flow and electrical wiring of the brain.
And the fMRI data coming out of places like Stanford and Harvard right now is absolutely mind-blowing.
It takes everything we've talked about and finally gives it a mechanical explanation. We are looking at two very different biological phenomena: functional decoupling in hypnosis and structural plasticity in meditation.
Let's look at the functional state of hypnosis first. The pioneering work here belongs to Dr. David Spiegel at Stanford University.
He utilized functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, to observe the brains of highly hypnotizable individuals in real time as they transition from normal waking consciousness into deep trance.
An fMRI tracks blood oxygen level-dependent signals. When a specific brain region becomes active, it requires more oxygen, so blood flow increases to that area.
By tracking the blood, Spiegel identified 3 distinct hallmark functional shifts that occur exclusively during hypnosis.
Let's break these 3 shifts down deeply, because this is where the mystery finally becomes mechanics.
Okay, the first major shift Spiegel found was a massive downregulation in a region called the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, or the DACC.
Yes, the DACC is a critical node within the brain's salience network.
The salience network is a vital evolutionary survival tool. It functions as the brain's radar dish.
It operates constantly in the background, scanning both your external environment and your internal bodily sensations, deciding what information is salient, what is important enough to warrant your conscious attention.
If you are deeply engrossed in a book and suddenly you hear your name spoken from across a noisy room, it is your salience network that instantly rips your attention away from the book and directs it toward the voice.
It's constantly asking, is there a threat? Is there an opportunity?
And during hypnosis, the fMRI shows the activity in the DACC just plummets. The radar dish powers down.
Exactly. And this biological mechanism perfectly explains the phenomenological experience of being in a trance.
When the salience network shuts down, you stop scanning the environment.
You stop worrying about the hum of the air conditioner, the traffic outside the window, or the itch on your leg.
It induces a state of profound absorption and hyperfocus.
The subject locks entirely onto the clinician's voice because the brain's primary distraction engine has been neurologically disconnected.
Okay, so the radar is off, the subject is hyperfocused. What is the second shift?
The second shift is an increase in functional connectivity between the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the DLPFC, and the insula.
Let's define those regions. The DLPFC is basically the CEO of the brain. It handles executive function, cognitive control, working memory, and decision-making.
Right, and the insula is a deeply buried region of the cortex that processes interoception.
Interoception meaning internal bodily sensations.
Yes, emotions, and crucially, pain signals from the body. During normal waking states, these two regions communicate, but they operate somewhat independently.
During hypnosis, the fMRI shows their activity synchronizing. They wire together.
The brain-body connection is literally strengthened. The CEO suddenly has a direct, high-speed fiber optic cable down to the pain processing center.
And this synchronization is the specific biological mechanism that makes hypnotic analgesia possible.
When executive control connects directly to the pain processing center, the brain can execute top-down modulation of how sensory input is perceived.
The physical nociceptors in your hand might still send a pain signal up the spinal cord when placed in ice water, but the DLPFC overrides the insula,
instructing it not to translate that signal into the subjective experience of suffering.
Furthermore, this specific connectivity triggers localized endorphin release, providing endogenous chemical pain relief.
So we have hyperfocus and we have pain control. But the third shift Spiegel found is the one that really explains why people accept weird suggestions when hypnotized.
It's the decoupling of the DLPFC, the CEO, and the default mode network.
The default mode network, specifically the posterior cingulate cortex, is highly active when your brain is ostensibly doing nothing.
If you are sitting on a train, daydreaming, ruminating about the past, worrying about the future, or engaging in deep self-referential thinking, your DMN is lit up like a Christmas tree.
It is the neurological seat of your ego, your autobiography, and your inner critic.
It's the voice in your head that says, "You can't do that. That's embarrassing. This won't work."
Precisely. In normal consciousness, your executive function constantly consults your inner critic before taking action.
But Spiegel found that during hypnosis, these two networks decouple. They stop communicating.
You are disconnecting executive control from the ego.
Which means the critical faculty is temporarily suspended. If a clinician suggests that your hand is glued to the table, normally your inner critic would say, "That's ridiculous, just lift it."
But because the DMN is decoupled, that critical evaluation never happens.
The executive center accepts the suggestion as a valid premise and acts on it without cognitive friction or self-consciousness.
It is a remarkable functional state. It is dynamically rerouting information in real time to alter perception.
But it's vital to contrast this functional state with the neuroimaging we have on deep meditation, because meditation shows us something fundamentally different.
Right. Hypnosis changes how the brain fires in the moment. But Sarah Lazar's MRI research on mindfulness-based stress reduction at Harvard shows that meditation physically changes the brain's mass.
It is a structural state. It alters the hardware through neuroplasticity and cortical gyrification, which is the actual physical folding and thickening of the cerebral cortex.
Lazar utilized voxel-based morphometry, which allows researchers to measure highly localized differences in brain anatomy.
She took individuals who had never meditated, put them through an 8-week MBSR program, and scanned them before and after.
The anatomical changes in just 2 months were staggering. The scans revealed a measurable decrease in gray matter density in the amygdala.
The amygdala is the core of our limbic system. It is the primitive fear, anxiety, and stress processing center. It's the engine of the fight-or-flight response.
As the amygdala physically shrinks in mass, the participants report a massive downregulation of baseline anxiety and perceived stress. Their alarm system is structurally smaller.
But while the fear center shrinks, higher-order regions of the brain literally bulk up.
Lazar documented increased cortical thickness in the prefrontal cortex, enhancing focus and executive control.
She found increased density in the left hippocampus, which is absolutely crucial for memory consolidation and emotional regulation.
And she also saw growth in the temporoparietal junction, right? The area that handles empathy and perspective taking.
So for you listening, think of the difference this way. Hypnosis is a temporary software patch.
You install it for an hour to dynamically reroute your system resources to solve an immediate problem, like turning off pain receptors for a dental procedure, or bypassing the inner critic to reframe a phobia.
But a daily mindfulness meditation practice is a long-term hardware upgrade.
Over the course of weeks and months, you are physically adding more RAM and a faster processor to your brain.
That analogy highlights the most profound question in the current research. Neurobiologists are looking at this data and realizing there is a massive synthesis missing.
We treat clinical hypnosis and mindfulness meditation as two completely separate modalities. But look at the neural real estate they occupy.
Both interventions heavily modulate the exact same territories: the default mode network, the insula, the prefrontal cortex, and the amygdala.
So what happens if you combine them?
That is the frontier. Researchers are proposing a 12-month longitudinal study to answer a critical question.
Does the acute functional decoupling of the default mode network that we see in a brief hypnosis session eventually lead to the structural cortical thickening observed in long-term meditators?
If a patient utilizes self-hypnosis every single day, repeatedly turning off their salience network and disconnecting their inner critic, do they eventually get the structural hardware upgrade of a Zen monk?
Do the temporary functional pathways become permanent structural highways?
It's a huge question. It implies we can physically architect our own brains on demand.
But understanding the fMRI data is just the theory. We have to look at the practical application.
How do clinicians actually hack these neural networks in a real room, in real time? How do they guide a patient from normal waking consciousness into a state where their default mode network is completely decoupled?
Let's look at the actual mechanics of the mind. How do they test and induce trance?
Before a master clinician ever attempts a formal hypnotic induction, they will almost always conduct suggestibility testing.
Often, they won't even use the word hypnosis. They will frame these tests to the client as simple imagination exercises.
Because if you say test, the client's performance anxiety spikes, the salience network goes into overdrive, and they fail.
Exactly. The purpose of these exercises is to gauge the client's cognitive architecture. The clinician needs to know exactly how this specific brain translates cognitive ideas into physiological responses.
A classic, universally used example is the lemon test, which assesses sensory modalities, specifically visual, auditory, and kinesthetic processing.
I love the lemon test because it proves how easily the mind controls the body. The clinician asks you to close your eyes and vividly imagine a lemon.
But they build it with incredible sensory detail. You visualize the bright yellow, dimpled, waxy rind. You imagine placing it on a wooden cutting board.
You hear the sharp crunch as a knife slices through the center. You smell the sharp citrus mist spraying into the air.
Then the clinician tells you to imagine picking up a wedge and biting deeply into it, feeling the acidic, sour juice explode across your tongue.
If you are sitting there doing this and your mouth actually starts watering if you begin to salivate, the clinician knows your mind-body connection is highly active.
And let's look at the biology of that salivation. Your salivary response is an autonomic function driven by the superior and inferior salivatory nuclei located deep in the medulla oblongata of the brainstem.
You cannot consciously tell your medulla to secrete saliva.
But if merely imagining a visual and auditory stimulus triggers the brainstem to alter an autonomic function, the clinician knows you possess hyperconnectivity between your visual cortex and your autonomic regulatory centers.
They now know to tailor your subsequent hypnosis using highly visual metaphors because your brain translates pictures into physical reality.
They also use ideomotor tests, which are just wild to watch. These test involuntary motor movement. The magnetic hands test is a great one.
You hold your arms straight out in front of you, palms facing each other, a few inches apart. The clinician asks you to imagine powerful electromagnets strapped to your palms, pulling them together.
If your hands start drifting toward each other in tight, jerky, involuntary micro-movements, you pass.
There is also the postural sway test, where you stand with your feet together, eyes closed. The clinician suggests that you are a tall pine tree swaying in a strong breeze.
If your vestibular system, your balance center, surrenders to the suggestion and you physically begin to fall backward, relying on the clinician to catch you, it proves a massive surrender of executive control.
Or the hand clasp test.
The hand clasp is intense. You interlock your fingers tightly. The hypnotist suggests that your hands are a solid block of wood, that they are glued together.
And then they give you a double bind. The harder you try to pull them apart, the tighter they lock.
And you literally watch people struggling, their muscles straining, entirely unable to pull their own hands apart.
These motor tests evaluate the subject's baseline capacity for motor inhibition and catalepsy. Once the clinician knows exactly how the subject's brain processes suggestions, they transition seamlessly into the actual induction.
And in modern clinical practice, particularly medical hypnosis, the Dave Ellman induction is considered the absolute gold standard.
Unlike progressive muscle relaxation, which is what most people imagine when they think of hypnosis, the slow 20-minute process of relaxing your toes, then your ankles, then your calves, the Ellman method achieves profound surgical-level somnambulism in about 3 to 4 minutes.
It is incredibly fast.
It is fast because it is an engineered psychological algorithm. It doesn't rely on soothing the client to sleep. It relies on a tightly sequenced series of compliance loops that methodically shut down the brain's executive networks.
Let's walk through the 4 steps. Step 1 is eyelid catalepsy.
The clinician asks you to close your eyes and relax the tiny muscles around your eyelids so deeply that they simply will not work.
Once you have that relaxation, the clinician says, hold on to that relaxation and test them to make sure they won't open.
You are being asked to consciously try to open your eyes while subconsciously maintaining the exact relaxation that prevents them from opening. It is a therapeutic double bind.
Neurologically, this creates a massive spike in cognitive dissonance. Deliberately failing a simple, conscious motor task, opening your own eyes, creates a paradox in the executive network.
The brain hates cognitive dissonance. It desperately seeks to resolve it. In this scenario, the easiest way for the brain to resolve the paradox is to accept the implicit premise that the hypnotist is now operating the system.
By trying and failing to open your eyes, you effectively hand over your executive function to the clinician's voice.
Step 2 is vote fractionation, named after Oscar Vogt. The clinician repeatedly asks you to open and close your eyes. Open them, close them, and go deeper. Open them, close them, and go 10 times deeper.
It utilizes a principle called homoaction, the idea that repeating a known action makes the subsequent attempts easier and more profound.
But the underlying mechanism of vote fractionation is entirely biological. Think about what happens when you open your eyes. Your salience network and your visual cortex have to instantly power up and orient you to the waking reality of the room.
When you close your eyes, they power down. By forcing the brain to rapidly open and close the eyes, the clinician is causing rapid metabolic fatigue in the prefrontal cortex.
You are depleting the ATP, the cellular energy in the executive network. By constantly forcing the brain to reorient, it quickly exhausts its available executive resources, forcing the brain to surrender to a less energy-intensive state.
You literally tire the conscious mind out.
Step 3 is physical catalepsy. Now that the mind is tired, the clinician tests the body.
The hypnotist reaches out, lifts your arm by the wrist, and says it will drop as loose and limp as a wet dish rag.
If you try to help them lift your arm, or if it falls with any residual muscle tension, they know you aren't fully relaxed.
They will correct you, having you drop it again and again until it falls with absolute dead gravitational weight. It is biometric proof of profound physical relaxation.
With the body entirely offline, Step 4 attacks the final stronghold of the conscious mind, working memory.
This is achieved through the number block. The subject is instructed to count backward aloud from 100, doubling their mental relaxation with each descending number.
But crucially, they are given the suggestion that by the time they reach 98 or 97, the numbers will simply fade away and disappear completely.
The clinician forces the subject to push the numbers out of their own mind. 100. Double your relaxation. 99. Let them fade. 98. Make them go away.
Okay, this is where I have to pause and push back.
Oh, God!
I have seen this happen, where a patient gets to 97 and they just stop talking. The clinician asks, are the numbers gone? And the patient weakly nods. Is that genuine memory loss?
Did their brain actually forget how to count backward from 100, or are they just playing along because they are tired of the drill?
It is absolutely not genuine amnesia, but it is also not mere social compliance. They aren't just playing along. What you're witnessing is a phenomenon known as suggestion-induced aphasia.
The mechanism is brilliant. The brain has a limited working memory buffer in the prefrontal cortex.
The induction gives the brain a dual task: actively double the physical sensation of relaxation while simultaneously holding a descending integer sequence in the working memory.
It's cognitive overload.
Exactly. The cognitive load maxes out the buffer. Furthermore, the suggestion that the numbers will disappear specifically targets and suppresses Broca's area, the primary motor speak center in the frontal lobe.
They literally lose the physiological ability to articulate the number 97.
They know the number is 97, but the neural pathway required to translate that thought into vocal cord vibration is temporarily severed by the suggestion.
When you strip away the magic, it is pure, exploitable neurobiology.
Yes, incredible. But the Dave Ellman induction relies on direct instruction. It relies on a patient who is willing to overtly comply with commands like relax your eyes and count backward.
But what if you have a patient who is highly analytical, deeply skeptical, or psychologically resistant, someone who fights direct commands?
That brings us to an entirely different, completely covert way to bypass the critical faculty. You don't use direct commands, you use syntax. You use linguistic architecture.
And this transition belongs almost entirely to the genius of Dr. Milton H. Erickson.
Erickson was a psychiatrist who completely revolutionized the field by recognizing a fundamental human trait: psychological reactance.
Reactance is the innate biological urge to resist when we feel our autonomy is being threatened or controlled.
If an authoritarian hypnotist commands you, you will relax right now. Your ego defense mechanisms instantly activate to fight that command.
Erickson realized that if you want to bypass a heavily guarded fortress, you don't use a battering ram. You use a Trojan horse.
He developed a highly complex architecture of indirect suggestion. His language patterns were studied and codified by early neurolinguistic programmers into what is known as the Milton model.
The primary objective of the Milton model is to utilize artfully vague language. Erickson would use complex, ambiguous sentence structures that provided a framework, but omitted specific details.
By remaining vague, he forced the client's subconscious mind to do the heavy lifting of filling in the blanks using their own internal resources and memories.
Because the client is generating the specific meaning internally, the suggestion becomes hyper-personalized. You can't resist an idea if your own brain originated it.
Let's look at the specific techniques within the Milton model, because it is essentially conversational hypnosis. We mentioned the therapeutic double-bind earlier with the eyelid test, but Erickson used the double-bind conversationally to create the illusion of choice.
Unlike a pathological double-bind, which is used by abusers to track someone in a lose-lose situation, causing severe distress, an Ericksonian double-bind offers two distinct choices that both inevitably lead to the practitioner's desired therapeutic outcome.
You give the conscious mind a meaningless choice to keep it busy, while the unconscious mind accepts the hidden premise.
For example, instead of commanding a patient to enter trance, the clinician might ask, "Would you prefer to enter trance now? Or would you like to keep your eyes open for a few more moments while that comfort naturally spreads through your body?"
Let's analyze the grammar of that sentence. The conscious mind hears a polite question offering autonomy. It thinks, I am in control, I can choose when to start.
But the underlying syntactic presupposition, the foundational premise of the entire sentence, is that the patient is going to enter trance.
The conscious mind is so busy evaluating the binary choice, now or later, that it completely fails to evaluate the presupposition. The premise is accepted as absolute truth.
Then there is the technique of embedded commands and analogical marking. This is where you hide a direct authoritarian command inside a larger, completely innocent sentence.
But to make sure the unconscious mind registers the command, you mark it by shifting your vocal tonality, lowering your volume, or using a subtle physical gesture exactly as you say the hidden words.
A classic authoritarian command is relax deeply. It causes reactance. But using the Milton model, a clinician might say, I don't know if you will begin to relax deeply, but you can just listen to the sound of my voice.
The conscious mind hears a statement of uncertainty. I don't know if you will. It drops its defenses because there is no threat.
But the clinician dropped their vocal pitch perfectly on the words relax deeply. The conscious mind ignores it, but the pattern recognition engine of the unconscious mind strips away the surrounding syntax and processes the marked command.
Another foundational technique in this architecture is pacing and leading. This involves verbally acknowledging the client's undeniable real-time sensory reality pacing and then smoothly linking it via conjunctions to a desired behavioral outcome leading.
As you sit in that chair and feel the weight of your feet on the floor and hear the sound of the rain against the window, you can allow yourself to drift into a deep, profound state of comfort.
Perfect execution. The first three statements are empirically undeniably true. The brain's reality testing function verifies them. Yes, I am in a chair. Yes, feet on the floor. Yes, rain on the window.
Because the brain has established a pattern of absolute agreement, it is primed by momentum to accept the fourth statement drifting into comfort as equally true, even though it is a directed suggestion.
Erickson was perhaps most famous for his use of isomorphism and metaphor. He would sit with a highly resistant patient. Instead of doing therapy, he would just start telling a long, rambling, seemingly pointless story about a farmer he once knew or a tomato plant he grew in his garden.
But the stories were never pointless. They were structurally isomorphic. The narrative structure of the story mapped perfectly onto the structural dynamics of the client's psychological problem.
If a client was struggling with feeling stuck in an abusive marriage, Erickson might tell a vivid story about a horse that was trapped in a burning barn and how it eventually realized it could kick the stall door open.
The client's conscious mind just relaxes and enjoys a folksy story. It doesn't put up any defenses because it's just a story about a horse.
But the unconscious mind recognizes the structural parallel and extracts the therapeutic solution, kick the door open, without any conscious resistance.
Now, this all sounds like an art form, but modern researchers are trying to quantify it biologically. How do we measure the effectiveness of this linguistic architecture scientifically?
Neuroscientists are utilizing functional near-infrared spectroscopy, or FNIRs, combined with high-resolution eye-tracking pupillometry.
Pupillometry measures the exact dilation of the pupil, right?
Yes, and pupillary dilation is an incredibly accurate involuntary biomarker for cognitive load. When your brain is working hard to process complex information, your pupils dilate slightly.
FNRS measures the localized blood oxygenation in the prefrontal cortex. The research goal is to prove that Ericksonian double binds and ambiguous syntax maximize cognitive load.
So the complex sentences basically cause a traffic jam in the brain.
Exactly. They force the working memory to evaluate multiple overlapping semantic pathways simultaneously. This massive data processing requirement completely saturates the executive control network.
When the prefrontal processing capacity is full, the embedded commands and therapeutic metaphors bypass the analytical filter and slip entirely undetected into the implicit processing pathways of the limbic system.
The language is literally a DDoS attack on the conscious mind.
It is brilliant. We've covered light relaxation, we've covered deep somnambulism, we've covered the covert language used to induce it. But the clinical literature doesn't stop there.
What happens when you push human consciousness to the absolute edge of the map? Let's dive into the deep end. Ultra-depth states and the concept of the superconscious.
The degree to which consciousness can be altered exists on a vast, measurable continuum. To categorize this depth, clinicians traditionally use the Aron's depth scale, developed by Harry Aarons.
It outlines 6 progressive stages of trance. Stages 1 and 2 are merely light hypnoidal states. The subject is deeply relaxed but retains full conscious awareness and memory.
Stage 3 introduces complete aphasia, like forgetting the number 97 and muscular catalepsy. Stage 4 brings the beginning of spontaneous amnesia and mild analgesia.
Stage 5 marks the onset of true somnambulism. This is where a subject can experience positive hallucinations.
Correct. A positive hallucination is the neurological ability to perceive a stimulus that does not exist in objective reality. The clinician might suggest there is a dog in the room, and the subject's visual cortex will actually render a dog. They will reach out and pet empty air.
And stage 6 is profound somnambulism. This is where you get negative hallucinations, which are much harder to produce.
A negative hallucination is failing to perceive something that actually does exist. The hypnotist can suggest that a chair in the middle of the room is gone, and the subject will literally bump into the chair because their visual cortex edited out of their reality.
Stage 6 is also where profound surgical anesthesia occurs.
But the literature ventures into states that exist far beyond stage 6. These are the ultra-depth states, and they are phenomenologically fascinating.
The first is the Esdale state, named after the Scottish surgeon James Esdale we discussed earlier. This state is clinically referred to as hypnotic coma.
When you see a patient in the Esdale state, it is almost eerie.
It is characterized by profound euphoria and a complete, spontaneous, whole-body anesthesia. The hypnotist doesn't even have to give a verbal suggestion for pain relief. The nervous system simply shuts off all nociception entirely.
It features a waxy precatatonic catalepsy. If the clinician lifts the subject's arm and lets go, the arm doesn't drop. It just locks into place, suspended in midair, defying gravity, without the subject showing any signs of muscle fatigue.
And what's interesting is the psychological shift. In the Aron stages, the subject is highly compliant, eagerly following the hypnotist's voice.
In the Esdale state, the euphoria is so intense that the subject often completely ignores the hypnotist. They simply don't care to follow instructions anymore because they don't want to be disturbed.
If a clinician possesses the skill to push a subject even deeper than Esdale, they hit what is called the Secourt state, discovered by Walter Secourt. Proponents refer to this as true ultra-depth.
It is described as an absolute absence of any residual muscular tension, massive subjective time distortion, and most controversially, the onset of rapid eye movement.
They claim the body goes into hyperregeneration in this state. But because traditional talk therapy is impossible in these deep states because the client won't or can't speak, practitioners use something called the Simpson Protocol, developed by Innes Simpson.
The Simpson Protocol is designed to conduct content-free trauma resolution while the client is entirely unresponsive in the Esdale or Secourt state.
Because verbal communication is offline, the protocol establishes a communication loop using nonverbal ideomotor finger signaling. The clinician sets up a physical baseline. The right index finger lifts involuntarily for yes. The left index finger lifts for no.
The literature surrounding the Simpson protocol claims that the clinician is communicating directly with the client's superconscious, defined as a higher, all-knowing, pure faculty of the mind.
The clinician can ask the superconscious to locate the root cause of a trauma and resolve it without the clinician or the conscious client ever actually knowing what the trauma was.
The finger just twitches, yes when the trauma is located, and yes when it is resolved.
Okay, I have to hit the brakes here violently.
Go for it.
We just spent the first 50 minutes of this deep dive rigorously debunking magnetic fluids, dismissing astrology, praising the secularization of the field, and grounding everything in fMRI data and cognitive load. And now the clinical literature is unironically throwing around terms like the superconscious, an all-knowing higher mind. Isn't that crossing right back into the mysticism we just worked so hard to escape?
I agree completely, and more importantly, so do the modern neurobiologists analyzing these protocols. They bring the scientific hammer down very hard on this specific terminology.
The current research aims to strip this esoteric language away entirely using high-level biometrics. When we look at the superconscious, researchers propose that we aren't talking to some mystical higher power or ethereal soul.
So what are we talking to when that finger twitches?
We are communicating with the brain's implicit, non-declarative memory networks. Declarative memory is your conscious recall, knowing what you ate for breakfast. Implicit memory handles emotional conditioning and automated motor skills.
When a clinician asks a question about trauma during the Simpson protocol, the ideomotor finger signaling is likely utilizing the basal ganglia.
The basal ganglia processes the emotional valence of the memory and executes a micromotor response to the finger, completely bypassing the prefrontal cortex.
The finger twitches without the CEO ever approving the movement. It's not superconscious, it's just the basal ganglia running the implicit memory database.
That makes infinitely more sense. It grounds it back in biology.
Exactly. And regarding the Sicard state, researchers are equally demanding of proof. The claim that a waking subject enters a state of physiological REM defies standard sleep architecture. Rapid eye movement requires a specific progression through non-REM sleep stages.
Right, you can't just jump from waking directly into REM.
Exactly. REM sleep is initiated by pontogeniculo-occipital waves, PGO waves. These are electrical spikes that originate in the pons of the brainstem, travel to the lateral geniculate nucleus, and terminate in the occipital lobe, the visual center.
That electrical cascade is what causes the rapid eye movements and initiates dreaming.
To prove the Sicard state is real, researchers demand polysomnographic telemetry. They need overnight sleep lab monitoring using EEG to measure brain waves, EMG to measure muscle atonia, and EOG to measure the physical eye movements.
They need to prove if the Sicard state is actually a waking REM anomaly. Is the brain somehow triggering PGO waves without entering a sleep cycle?
Until we have that hard telemetry data, these ultra-depth states remain fascinating anecdotal phenomenological observations, but they are not validated clinical targets.
So while reaching these ultra-depth states requires a master clinician, a willing subject, and a lot more scientific validation, the literature doesn't leave the rest of us empty-handed.
It provides highly specific, biologically grounded tools for you to take control of your own autonomic nervous system right now in your living room.
Let's move into our final section. Take the reins, self-regulation, and everyday application. And to understand the value of these tools, we have to start with the most intense scenario imaginable. Abreactions.
During any deep introspective work, whether it's hypnotherapy, intense meditation, or even a sudden trigger in everyday life, especially when dealing with complex PTSD or heavily repressed trauma, a person might experience an abreaction.
Phenomenologically, an abreaction is a sudden, intense, chaotic release of repressed emotion. The client might suddenly start sobbing uncontrollably, shaking, or screaming.
Some therapeutic schools believe abreactions are necessary and cathartic. They believe you have to let the poison out.
But the modern literature strongly warns against them, noting they can easily become malignant, actually re-traumatizing the patient by forcing them to relive the terror without emotional regulation.
The clinical manuals outline the psychological management of an abreaction, but the modern neurobiological perspective explains why it is so dangerous. A malignant abreaction isn't just an emotional outburst. It is a severe, acute neurochemical crisis.
What exactly is happening in the brain during an abreaction?
An implicit traumatic memory is triggered. Instantly, the amygdala fires a distress signal to the hypothalamus, which activates the sympathetic nervous system.
Your adrenal glands pump massive toxic spikes of norepinephrine and cortisol into your bloodstream. Your heart rate rockets, your breathing becomes shallow and rapid.
Crucially, this chemical flood effectively hijacks and shuts down your prefrontal cortex, The logical, rational part of your brain goes entirely offline. You cannot think your way out of an abreaction because the tool you use to think has been disabled by cortisol.
Modern clinicians are starting to use biometric tracking, like live heart rate variability monitors, to spot the physiological spike before the emotional outburst even happens.
But if it does happen, or if you are having a severe panic attack at home, you need a manual override for that chemical cascade. And the literature provides one of the most elegant tools ever designed, the Betty Erickson 3-2-1 technique.
Betty Erickson was Milton Erickson's wife and a brilliant collaborator in her own right. Her self-hypnosis grounding tool is elegantly simple on the surface, but profoundly brilliant in its underlying neurobiology.
To execute the technique, you sit quietly and acknowledge 3 things you can visually see in your environment. Then 3 things you can hear. Then 3 things you can physically feel.
So, out loud, or in your head, you would say, I see the edge of the desk, I see the lamp, I see the window frame, I hear the hum of the fan, I hear traffic outside, I hear the sound of my own breath, I feel the weight of my feet on the floor, I feel the band of my watch on my wrist, I feel the fabric of the chair against my back.
Precisely. Once you complete 3 of each, you immediately cycle down to 2. 2 visual, 2 auditory, 2 kinesthetic. Then you cycle down to 1 of each.
I look at the 3-2-1 technique, and I always compare it to giving a highly destructive, hyperactive toddler a very boring sorting task.
That's a great analogy.
During a panic attack or an abreaction, your amygdala is the toddler, screaming that you are in mortal danger and setting the house on fire. By forcing your conscious mind to rapidly scan your environment, identify mundane, non-threatening sensory data, categorize it, and verbalize it, you are giving the toddler an overwhelming sorting task.
It keeps the threat center so incredibly busy processing mundane data that the rest of the house, your executive brain, can finally relax and put the fire out.
That analogy is neurologically spot on. The 3-2-1 technique works because it aggressively leverages cognitive overload, much like the Elman induction, but for a different purpose.
By forcing your working memory to process multisensory data across visual, auditory, and kinesthetic neural pathways sequentially, it severely taxes the brain's executive function.
The mind is kept so busy processing non-threatening, undeniable, empirical facts about the present moment that it sends a massive overriding signal to the autonomic nervous system.
It tells the brain, look at all this data. There is no tiger in the room.
Exactly. It signals that the environment is definitively safe. This realization preemptively slams the brakes on the malignant neurochemical cascade of cortisol and norepinephrine.
It allows the parasympathetic nervous system to come back online, shifting you out of a panic attack and guiding you into a naturalistic, grounded, lightly focused trance state.
And this mechanism perfectly ties into the other daily self-regulation tools the literature explores, like non-sleep deep rest, or NSDR, and traditional yoga nidra.
NSDR and yoga nidra utilize a technique called somatic mapping. You lie perfectly still and systematically rotate your conscious awareness through a highly detailed map of your body's sensory endings.
You focus entirely on your right thumb, then the index finger, then the palm, moving systematically through the entire physical structure.
What is that doing to the brainwaves?
By systematically withdrawing your sensory attention from the external world and focusing it entirely on internal topography, you force a massive shift in brainwave architecture.
You shift out of the agitated high-frequency beta waves of normal waking stress and drop down into relaxed alpha waves and eventually the deeply restorative theta waves associated with REM sleep and deep meditation.
And it changes the chemical bath of the brain too, right?
Absolutely. Entering these alpha or theta states actively modulates your neurochemistry. It increases the production of GABA, which is the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. It acts as a natural tranquilizer, dampening anxiety.
Simultaneously, it increases the release of serotonin and dopamine, enhancing cognitive clarity and emotional stability. You are actively altering your neurochemistry, regulating your nervous system without ingesting a single pharmacological pill.
And that, right there, is the ultimate thesis of all this material. That is the thread that connects this entire 4,000-year history.
Whether we are looking at a patient waiting for a god in an ancient Greek sleep temple, a subject having their default mode network decoupled inside David Spiegel's fMRI machine, or you sitting in your living room utilizing the Betty Erickson 3-2-1 technique to stop a panic attack, the core mechanism is identically the same.
The brain's hardware is physically malleable, and its software can be rewritten in real time. We just finally have the scientific vocabulary to explain how the code is written.
We truly do. We have evolved past the mysticism and the magnetism. By integrating the acute functional techniques of clinical hypnosis, like the rapid inductions and linguistic architecture, with the long-term structural benefits of mindfulness meditation, we possess an unprecedented toolkit for systemic, physiological, and psychological healing.
It has been a truly incredible journey today. We've traced this phenomenon from the spectacle of Mesmer's iron rods to the precision of high-density EEG and targeted neuroplasticity.
We've seen how expectation, focus, and carefully constructed syntax can entirely bypass our deepest critical defenses.
And we've seen that the power was never in the operator, the magnet, or the swinging watch. The power is, and always has been, embedded in the architecture of the subject's own mind.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought. We started today by talking about that X-ray machine, the comfort of seeing a broken bone, of knowing exactly what is wrong and exactly how to fix it physically.
We've spent this time looking at how the mind is not a static bone. It is an incredibly dynamic operating system.
We've seen how cognitive expectations and hyper-focused attention can literally turn off pain receptors during major surgery, or structurally shrink the fear centers in our brain over time.
If our own focused attention has the biological power to do that.
Wait, if it can do all that, what other autonomic functions are you secretly in control of? If the mind is an operating system, what other administrator privileges do you possess right now in your own biology that you have simply forgotten the password to? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.